Experience it here. Step into a world of inspiration at the 2024 ASCO Annual Meeting, where the thrill of scientific discovery and the power of global connections converge. Join us in Chicago, May 31st through June 4th. Register now at am.asco.org.
Hello, I'm Dr. John Sweetenham from the UT Southwestern Harold T. Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center and host of the ASCO Daily News podcast. Multiple myeloma is the second most common hematologic malignancy, and the American Cancer Society estimates that there will be more than 35,000 new cases of the disease diagnosed in the United States this year. The emergence of several novel therapies over the last decade has transformed the therapeutic landscape for multiple myeloma, and chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR T-cell therapy, is one of the newest treatments for this disease, which has created a great deal of buzz. Shaji Kumar is an internationally renowned investigator of novel therapeutics and next-generation treatment options for patients with multiple myeloma, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the podcast today to discuss innovations in CAR T-cell therapy in this space. Dr. Kumar is Professor of Medicine and Chair of the Myeloma Group, as well as Chair of Research in the Division of Hematology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of The Hematologist. You'll find our full disclosures are available in the transcript of this episode, and disclosures of all guests on the podcast are available at asco.org/DNpod. Shaji, it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks, John.
Shaji, to begin with, maybe we could ask you for an overview of where CAR T-cell therapy sits in multiple myeloma right now. We know that CAR T-cell therapy has improved the survival for some patients with myeloma in recent years, but of course, relapse still remains a problem. Can you tell us a little about the therapies that are currently approved for multiple myeloma in the CAR T-cell space, and what are the potential benefits and challenges of these products?
Absolutely. It has been a revolution, I think, in terms of therapies for multiple myeloma during the past decade. We have seen so many new treatments approved for myeloma, and as a consequence, the survival of patients with myeloma has significantly improved. 2 decades ago, we used to tell patients a median survival of 3 years, and today we tell patients a median survival of 8 to 10 years, a number that is continuing to go up. And it is all because of the new treatments that have become available for patients, especially over the past decade, among which CAR T-cell therapy clearly has been a game changer. Now, the main treatments that we were relying on for the past 2 decades have been the immunomodulatory drugs, the proteasome inhibitors, and more recently, the anti-CD38 monoclonal antibodies. Unfortunately, what we see in the clinic is that patients go through these therapies and various combinations of these agents, and often over the 6 to 10 years after the diagnosis, they often become refractory to these drugs. And then we are left with very few choices, if any, for controlling the disease. And that's where the CAR T cells have really made an impact. Over the past several years, the clinical trials have shown that the CAR T cell therapy is highly effective. In fact, when we look at the initial trials that have been done in this space, majority of these CAR T cells have been targeted towards what we call BCMA, or a B cell maturation antigen that is present on the both normal and abnormal plasma cells. Now, the CAR T cell, or the concept of CAR T cells, have been around for a while, and we already seen success in other hematological malignancies. But it has been a little late compared to the other diseases in terms of its arrival to the myeloma field. But over the past few years, we have seen some dramatic progress. We currently have 2 different CAR T cells that are approved and available in the clinic. We have idacaptogene viculuzole, or ide-cel, and also the ciltacabtagene, which is also called a cilta-cel. Now, both of these CAR T cells are targeted towards BCMA. Now, in the early trials that have been done with both these CAR T cells, we have seen patients who have become refractory to all the available therapies responding. Upwards of 90% of these patients are responding to these CAR T cells. Now, we are seeing responses that have previously not typically been seen in any of the other therapies. Not only the high response rates, but also the depth of response. what we are seeing is a significant number of these patients, nearly half of these patients can actually be minimal residual disease negative in the bone marrow after the CAR T cell therapies. And this is clearly unprecedented in this myeloma space. Now, the approval for both these CAR T cells have been based on the experience in patients who have become refractory to the currently available therapies. And kind of the line in sand that the FDA has drawn for approval for these drugs have been at least 4 prior therapies. In those patients, when you look at the studies that have been done, both for the ide-cel and the cilta-cel, it clearly demonstrates the advantages, and we can look at the data that's available kind of in the 3 groups. So we have the single arm studies, the early phase 1, phase 2 trials that have been done with both these CAR-Ts. For ide-cel, we have the KARMA trial, and for the cilta-cel, we have the CARTITUDE trials. In the initial studies, as I previously mentioned, we are seeing responses upwards of 90% for these. We are seeing the disease control that is lasting at least a year or more with these CAR T cells. Now, of course, the question is, we do need randomized phase 3 trials to demonstrate that this is indeed true. Even before the phase 3 trials came on, there have been multiple case control studies that have been done where the outcome of patients getting these CAR T cells were compared to real world controls or cohorts of patients who did not get these therapies. And these studies demonstrated that the outcomes of patients getting CAR T cells were significantly better than what has been shown in the real world control population. And then finally, we have, of course, the phase 3 trials that have read out in patients with relapsed myeloma. In fact, in a group of patients in earlier stage of the disease than who were studied in those single arm studies. Now, based on the results from the single arm studies, clearly we have the approval from the FDA for use of CAR T cell in this late stage of the disease. And with the phase 3 trials that have read out, both the KARMA 3 trial and the CARTITUDE 4 trials clearly again demonstrates that these CAR T cells are much more effective than what we would have seen with the conventional therapies if those patients were assigned to those treatments. Now, clearly, it's not only a question of the efficacy. We also know that they do come with some toxicities, and we have a good sense of the toxicities from those initial phase 1 and phase 2 trials. Now, as we have seen with the other diseases, the two kind of the major categories of toxicities that we see are the cytokine release syndrome and the neurological toxicity associated with CAR T. Now, in terms of the clinical features and the presentations, they are not different than what we have seen with the CAR Ts used in other hematological malignancies, but we do see different frequencies of these in the myeloma patient population. Now, the cytokine release syndrome is something that is seen in a majority of the patients, at least in the lower grades. And over the time that we have been using the CAR T, I think we have all become a lot more familiar with the management of the cytokine release syndrome. And we have very effective therapies to manage and to some extent maybe even prevent the onset of cytokine release syndrome in patients undergoing CAR T cell therapy. The neurological toxicity is another toxicity that is unique to these immunological therapies, what we call as the ICANS, or the immune cell effector associated neurological syndromes. And these, again, thankfully are much less frequent than what we see with the cytokine release syndrome. But even with the ICANS and other neurological toxicities associated with CAR T, we have better understanding of the biology behind it, and we also have a better modalities to monitor the patients for these toxicities and intervene in an appropriate manner, in a timely manner, and take care of that. So in addition to the ICANS and the cytokine release syndrome, we certainly do see other toxicities as well. We do see hematological toxicities, which is common for many of the treatments we use for hematological malignancies. Thankfully, these other toxicities can be easily managed. They often reverse themselves over time and hasn't really posed any major hurdles in terms of the utilization of these modalities of therapy for patients with myeloma.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Shaji. I'll return to some of the potential late effects of CAR T cell therapy in a moment. But before we get to that, as you know, in other hematologic malignancies, there has been a trend in recent years to moving CAR T cell therapy further up the therapeutic algorithm, as it were, so that consideration is being given to using this as a first line or second line therapy. Do you think there's a potential role for CAR T cell earlier in the treatment of multiple myeloma? So, for example, could you see a time when it may end up as maybe even second line treatment for this disease?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point. And I think just as with other cancers and as with myeloma too, with many of the therapies we use for myeloma in the newly diagnosed setting or the time of first relapse were all initially tested in these later relapses. We are following the same script even for the CAR T cells. In fact, the two phase 3 trials, the KarMMa 3 trial and the CARTITUDE 4 trial, enrolled patients in the earlier lines of therapy, either one prior line or two prior line for these trials. And what we have seen with both these phase 3 trials is the outcomes, both the progression-free survival outcomes and the response rates are significantly better compared to standard of care therapies that these patients otherwise would have received. Now, what is unclear at this point is, does every patient at the time of the first relapse need a CAR T cell therapy, or can we be more selective in terms of deciding which particular subgroup of patients can benefit more from this CAR T cell therapy in the different lines or different relapses? The bottom line is, I think the data that we have right now clearly points towards utility of CAR T cell therapy at earlier lines of treatment. Now, the question is, which patient do we need to do at which stage? In fact, when you look at the newly diagnosed setting, there are clinical trials that are ongoing that are looking at replacing autologous stem cell transplant with CAR T cell therapy. Those phase 3 trials are currently enrolling, where patients are being randomized to either the autologous stem cell transplant, which is considered a standard of care for eligible patients, or giving them a CAR T cell therapy. Similarly, even in the transplant ineligible patients, trials are exploring the possibility of using CAR T cell instead of giving patients a prolonged course of maintenance and consolidation. One of the beauties with the CAR T cell therapy right now is that it's a one-time treatment. You get the treatment, you don't get any additional therapies after that. It's a question that is being debated whether we be needing maintenance therapies after CAR T cell therapy, but I think that is, again, something that will have to be explored in the context of clinical trials. But certainly, I think over the next 5 years, we will see the CAR T cell therapy moving to earlier and earlier lines of therapy. My guess is in 5 years, there will be a subset of patients where we would offer them CAR T as part of the first line therapy. Some others, maybe based on disease characteristics and patient characteristics, we might use that at the time of first relapse or second relapse.
Great, thank you. Just to return to toxicities and some of the potential late effects, as you know, last November, the FDA launched an investigation to determine whether CAR T cell therapy can, in rare cases, cause secondary cancers. And you may remember that this was in response to reports of T cell malignancies in patients who'd received various types of CAR T cell immunotherapies. The FDA determined that the risk of T cell malignancies is applicable to all of the currently approved BCMA directed and CD19 directed genetically modified autologous CAR T cell immunotherapies. Could you care to comment on this, whether you have seen any evidence of this in your own work, and whether the events and the FDA investigation has impacted your clinical research or your clinical practice in any way in terms of patient monitoring or maybe in terms of trial accrual?
This has been an important observation, as with all new therapies, whenever the question of long-term toxicities are brought up, especially second malignancies, it is something that needs to be looked into very carefully. And I think FDA is doing exactly that. There have been reports of second cancers, particularly the T cell cancers. In fact, there were some statements that came out recently from FDA where they commented on the fact they had seen 22 cases of T cell cancers by the end of 2023. And in fact, in 3 of those cases, the genetic sequencing was performed. They did notice that the genetic material or the chimeric antigen receptor was inserted into these cancer cells as part of the process. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of understanding the mechanism and probably also understanding how prevalent these instances are. But I think based on what we know as of now, these cases form a very tiny fraction of the total number of CAR T therapies that have been, again, used in patients with lymphoma and myeloma. In our own day-to-day practice, this has not really affected how we view this therapy. It clearly has made a significant impact for patients with no other treatment options. So in the daily practice, we still continue to use CAR T as we have done before these reports came out. But we do tell the patients about the risk and what we know about the risk of these T-cell malignancies. In addition to the T-cell malignancies, there have also been reports of myelodysplastic syndromes in patients undergoing CAR T-cell therapy. Again, it is important to remember that, at least in the myeloma setting, many of these patients have had multiple lines of therapy, often with drugs that can cause second malignancies, particularly myelodysplastic syndrome. So I think a lot more work needs to be done in terms of understanding what is the direct impact of CAR T-cell therapy versus what was kind of lurking underneath because of the treatments that these patients had previously received. So I think it's important for us to continue to be very diligent, as with any new therapies that we introduce for treatment of our patients, but at the same time, understand that in the context of the benefits that these therapies bring to our patients, especially when they don't have other treatment options.
Absolutely. So, at least for now, probably in the longer term, the benefits of the therapy certainly appear to outweigh the risks, although obviously it's important not to underestimate or minimize those risks. I wanted to change direction a little bit and talk a little bit in the final question about care disparities and CAR T cell. Of course, CAR Ts are typically offered at large cancer centers and are very expensive. And that means that there are issues of access to treatment. Added to that, of course, the literature shows us that non-Hispanic Black individuals are twice as likely to develop multiple myeloma compared to white counterparts. And furthermore, that at least right now, Black patients are less likely to receive these novel CAR T therapies and continue to be underrepresented in clinical trials. So obviously, this is a big, complex question, but can you talk to us a little bit about how outcomes differ between racial and ethnic groups who actually receive CAR T cell therapy for multiple myeloma? And could you maybe address what you think are the most appropriate strategies for minimizing the disparities in access?
That's a very, very important question, particularly in the context of multiple myeloma, where the African American individuals are at a higher risk of getting plasma cell malignancies. What we have, I think it's important to think about this in the context of what we know about disparities even before the CAR T cells came along. There have been a good amount of literature that have looked at the outcomes based and the type of therapies that could be impacted by this. So there have been studies that have looked at cooperative group trials, which often have a good representation of minorities and have shown that if patients get equal access to the advanced therapies that we have, their outcomes are comparable or sometimes even better for the African American patients compared to the Caucasian patients. So I think it's very, very important that the treatment strategies that we develop are equally accessible to everyone. Now, in terms of the CAR T cell therapy or immunotherapies, I don't think we have any concrete evidence to suggest that there is any difference in the outcomes. And I think it's reasonable to assume that if they are exposed to similar therapies, they will have similar outcomes, even in the context of immunotherapies. But at the same time, I think we need to continue to study this very diligently. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that the clinical trials actually accrue patients that is reflective of the society in general. This will allow us to understand if there isn't any differences that exist. In addition, I think the gap is there's a serious risk that with these expensive therapies that this gap can only widen. And I think that is one reason we have to be proactive, particularly with therapies like CAR T cell therapy, that not only are very expensive, but also requires quite a bit of logistical support for patients to go to larger centers to get these therapies, stay around these larger centers for upwards of a couple months, which means they are living outside of the usual society structure, and ensure that there's access to the resources that are needed to enable them to do that. So I think there's a lot that is still unknown, but I think we really need to be proactive, ensuring that there's equal access to these therapies.
Well, yes, thanks. A very thoughtful response to that question, also for the work that you are obviously doing to help address what clearly is an extremely important issue. I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights with us today, and also for the extraordinary work that you're doing and your team are doing to advance care for patients with multiple myeloma.
Thank you, John.
And thank you also to our listeners for joining us today. If you value the insights that you hear on the ASCO Daily News podcast, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.